James, hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success Podcast. It's great to have you on. When we spoke earlier, I was a little bit curious as to how letting go of day-to-day operations through systemization can not only free up your time, but unlock hidden opportunities for exponential revenue growth that you may not be seeing while you or members of your team are still quite hands-on. So I did a little bit of digging and I was quite surprised because I came across a bit of research that shows that businesses with well-documented processes and systems experience a 280% higher growth compared to those without. That's pretty significant and worth taking note of, in my opinion. But obviously, if this was easy, everyone would be doing it. You're helping businesses with this. So I was looking into some of the common barriers that businesses face and found that at least or one of the big ones at least, is that of clear documentation and standardization. In fact, a study by IDC found that 61% of employees struggle to find the information they need to do their jobs effectively. Another, of course, is the barrier of resistance to change. Implementing new systems and processes often met with skepticism and pushback from employees. In fact, a McKinsey study reveals that 70% of change programs fail due to employee resistance. And finally, of course, is the fact that there is a resistance to break free from the daily grind to focus on more strategic initiatives. A Harvard Business Review found that managers spend 41% of their time on administrative tasks, leaving little room for growth-oriented activities. So, James, I'd love to explore the possibility of how we could make optimization a reality in our organizations. Now, for listeners, you are the founder of BizTech Guru. You started this in 2018, but prior to that, your background's been quite varied. You've run a number of businesses, starting off in the manufacturing space and then running a accommodation place as well, and various other things in the lead up to that, covered various industries and business aspects. So I'm curious, given your successes in the past, why start BizTech Guru? Because I would imagine back in 2018, there was still a fair few consultancy and coaching type businesses around.
Thanks, Vinay. Great to be talking with you. Why did I start the business? I think you've already alluded to the fact that with my prior businesses that, yes, I had some successes. And when I think back to what was at the core of what allowed me to get freedom and have the business start to run without me being that center cog in the business, it was systems and processes. I wasn't necessarily aware of that at the time, but when I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that was the core element that allowed me to be freed up, to the degree that in the early days of the motel that you mentioned, in the first years of running that business, when I stepped in and took over, I was working 100 to 120 hours a week and didn't know what time of day it was, what day of the week it was. Skip forward to the latter years of being involved with that business, I'd only be working in the business about half an hour a month, which was really just approving batch payments and things like that. The last little things that I didn't want to let go of, just to maintain some control of sort of the finances. But the time that I spent in that business then was really just on binging business development and looking at what best practices were and using that business as the test bed for all these different ideas. The thing was that when I went out and started my new business back in 2018, I didn't have a good way of solving that problem of helping people systemize their business. It was sitting on the shelf as a problem that I didn't really know how to solve. I knew I'd solved it myself, but the way that I did it was terrible. I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy to try and have to go through the gauntlet of trial and error and making things up as you go. And it was in 2020 that I stumbled across David Jennings. I'd already known of him, but he'd just launched a book called Systemology in, I think, August of 2020. And for me, that was almost the magic bullet. That's the simplistic methodology of how he's identified this easy way of systemizing businesses really spoke to me. And when I think about the ways that I worked with people in the early days of helping coach and develop other businesses, it was that particular problem that was able to be solved so well that freed up opportunities.
And you are, if I understand this correctly, you are a certified Systemology practitioner. Is that correct? Or coach? Yep.
Correct. I'm a master
Okay.
systemologist now. There's only a couple of us getting around in that realm, and predominantly because I've worked so much with David Jennings, helping build out new ideas and methodologies for what really is
Mhm.
Systemology in terms of what is this simplistic but really impactful way of helping small businesses get systemized. And if I think back to what you were opening up today with about bigger businesses, and when we think about smaller businesses, and the difference between big and small businesses, other than the
Mm.
number of people, is the processes that they have behind
Certainly.
them. And when you gave some of those impressive stats about, was it
Yeah.
280% increase in performance, that actually quite rings true for the when I look at businesses who have a high degree of sophistication, which is really that they have
Mhm.
their way, their methodology about how they do what they do, as opposed to most small businesses, which is they've got things that work well and they can create a great client experience, but often it's very depending on who's doing what on different days of the week and which approach they pick for that.
Very true. I can certainly identify with some of those experiences given my past history. But I'm also curious, given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
It is that helping free business owners up is the conduit for creating a whole bunch of
Mhm.
opportunities for not just the business owners, not just the businesses that they run, but I guess for the community at large. My standpoint is that if you look at business owners who have the audacity to go out there, take huge amounts of personal and professional risk to start a business and can actually make a go of it, if we created more wealth and more time
Mhm.
freedom for those people, what would the
Yeah.
world be like? Because the amount of risk that they've taken and the knowledge that they've built through that journey of building a business means that they can create a really great impact on society at large and help not just their business grow, but their team members level up and the trickle down effects of that.
Most people, I think, at least from the conversations I've had, would intuitively understand that systems can certainly help their businesses. But given your area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know about systemization but should?
It's typically where to start. And that was very
Mhm.
much my experience. That I started with what was ever is in front of me. And when I came across Systemology and I started to look into that
Mhm.
methodology, it was that we have the critical client flow, which is how your business generates income. And it's not to necessarily look at your business as all being about making money. But then again, if your business is not generating income, then you don't have a
Mhm.
business. And so starting with that first to make sure that you can get the skeleton of your business performing without the business owner, such that the business owner can be separate to work on developing the business. Understanding that isn't actually really
Mhm.
difficult. It's actually quite simple to do. And if business owners appreciated that it is actually possible to get their business running without them in the day to day, such that they can then step back to work on exploring other opportunities, whether for the business or for themselves, that it's not impossible to do. And there's actually quite a straightforward.
You make a great point there. And I know there's at least a few people in the startup space who are probably listening to this and going, at what point in time should we really look at systemizing things? Because I'm probably in the startup phase. We're doing things that aren't really scalable. We're trying a
Mhm.
lot of things to ensure product market fit and get some traction. Is this the time to start systemizing things, or do we wait until we've found product market fit and got a few things, got a bit of traction in order to start systemizing?
It's a great question to ask because most people don't realize when that tipping
Mhm.
point arrives in their business. And it is the latter that you mentioned about understanding once you've got a bit of a better product market fit, it's only worthwhile systemizing what you do once you've got version one of your best
Mhm.
practice. If you're still in an area where for certain processes for how you do things, you still actually need to be making it up just to try and diversify, see what's actually going to work, doing little off the cuff
Mhm.
split testing, then don't bottle how you're doing things until you're content that you've actually got a decent
Mhm.
formula. Because that's really what we talk about with systemizing using systemology is you're just looking to bottle what your best practice is. Most people often think that you actually should be optimizing as you create processes. Not necessarily it's not a flawed way of thinking, but it's actually counterintuitive that you should actually just focus on getting your version one, because that is really where you get the leverage in your
Mhm.
business. And businesses are all about creating leverage by getting other people to help to delegate tasks to, such that higher skilled team members can be freed up to do the high skilled roles of then doing the optimizing as time goes by. So it's about bottling what's working when we know it works, to free that person up to dream up and make new ideas of what other opportunities we might explore in the business, and then we step up and ratchet up as well.
Great point there. I would love to hear your take on whether we should actually start systemizing the way we do early discovery and even outreach, even in a startup phase, because we don't have processes for that. That can come back to
Mhm.
bite us even after we get version 1.0 off the ground, because things are moving so fast, technologically speaking. And I think we're in a space where we need to constantly be in touch with the customer in order to cater to their, not just their pain points, as is often talked about, but their ever evolving needs in order to ensure there is a degree of relevance to them.
That probably comes back to, it's only bottling when you know it starts to work. So there's a balance here of identifying what things the team is seeing when they are working and making sure we capture them as we go
Okay.
along, but knowing when we're still hunting for
Mhm.
that solution and going, well, partly maybe it's keeping a record of what we are trying and seeing whether it's working. It could be as simple as a spreadsheet that we've tried this particular thing this week and we don't think that worked, or we're trying to capture some metrics around it. So I'd probably separate that from
Mhm.
systemizing versus that's just understanding what type of iterations of an approach we're
Okay.
trying. And the systemizing really only comes into the foreground once you start to go, we're seeing a
Mhm.
pattern here, we're seeing where these opportunities have been creating a consistent result. That's the consistent result. Then it's like, yes, that's when we should start bottling it and going down the path of, hey everyone, this is what we've identified as our best practice, and this is what we're going to do for that particular topic. Still keep your eyes out for
Mm.
opportunities, but we know this formula is working for us right now.
So, with the many conversations I'm sure you're having, I'd be curious to hear why people are approaching you in the first place. Because I'm not sure that many people go, "Oh, I have a systems problem." They're often identifying with other symptoms, and if so, what are the types of questions or issues that they approach you with?
If I was to think about when people first approach me and what they're often approaching me about, it's probably three main reasons. It's that they are
Mhm.
unsure what's necessarily stopping them in their business, and therefore they're looking to explore and just brainstorm out ideas around what they're seeing, the symptoms that you mentioned before about what's going on. Second, it's typically about them knowing that they're trying to scale, but they're hitting a bit of a glass
Right.
ceiling. And typically, people focus on
Mhm.
operations and trying to get the operational side of business working for them, because that's where they see the fires going on in their business, and then turn around and start focusing on things like sales and marketing because they feel like they can turn that engine up because operations is
Mm.
now working. But a few months later, they turn around and see that operations is all chaotic again, and having conversations like, hey, we all agreed that we're going to do XYZ from now on, but we're all doing ABC still. And so seeing those type of things occur, that's what often leads people to go, hey, I need to start getting some systemization going. The third thing I think is that people are looking to start to step back. They've started to see, we talk about key persons
Mhm.
of dependence. It's that there's one person that's that important cog within a business, that if you try to remove that person, then things start to
Mhm.
fall over. And it's typically because there's no knowledge captured as a best
Mm.
practice for how they do things. And when you start to go, that person's looking at taking 4 to 6 weeks off next year, I realize we now have a problem, because if that person's going to take that holiday overseas or whatever it might be, then we're going to get really
Mm.
caught out. And then maybe they start to go, oh, hang on, what if that happened for that person and that person? And they go, So it may be for the team members within the business, or in fact, it may just be the
Mm.
business owner. And it's quite common that people approach me and say, I regularly take 2, 4, 5 weeks off a year, but I'd like to start taking more. How do I do that? And that's what
I'd imagine there's not just a mind shift, but also a heart shift required to get them to see the value of systems and how it could be done better if they're already investing in it. How do you help them navigate that journey? Yeah.
it's an important point, and it's actually often something I bring up in the very first time I dive
Mhm.
deep with someone about pulling apart what they actually want to do with their business. Typically, around about the time that I talk about that critical client flow that I mentioned before, because at that point, we get someone's entire business, the core of their business, on one page.
Mm.
And when you can hold that up in front of someone and say, is that how your business makes money? And they're like, yes. And then you say, great, what if we delegated all that work to other team members? And they're like, okay, yes, because once we get the
Mm.
processes for each of those tasks and we can delegate it, yes. And then I say, what would you do? And they go, oh, and you see their face change and they go, I don't know. And that's a really common reaction because the business has typically been built around them. It's their baby. And then they start to go through this process of what am I if I'm not that center cog in the business? And when you push them a little bit further, they go, I don't want that to happen because I want to still have the business. I want to be involved in the business. It's great, but let's look at how you might be involved in your business. And then typically people start to say, if I didn't have to work 40, 50 hours a week inside the business, I'd probably spend time on developing this new product or this new approach that we'd been thinking about that I never had time for. Or I'd probably start mentoring some of my juniors and helping level up some of my more senior team members and developing them. Or I'd probably start taking more time off and spending it with my family. It's a process of letting go and understanding that letting go, yes, it's going to be change and it's going to be a bit different, but there's so many more opportunities out there once you start to feel comfortable letting go and seeing that when we do have these processes and we do get the team on board with going, hey, this is actually great for me and for the business if we have these processes, and the business owner starts to trust that having the
Mm.
people and the processes is a great formula for them not having to be so heavily involved in the day to day, then they can start to build that trust and feel comfortable about letting go.
How would this conversation look like with those people that you mentioned were critical to the overall workflow? Or I think the term you used was key person dependency, because I would imagine if they are aware of the fact that they are key to an entire process, there might at times be resistance to change, given that there may be the impression that they're being made redundant, so to speak, or certainly that they no longer have as much control over things as they used to, etc. I would imagine those can be rather challenging conversations. How do you address that?
To implement processes. And so I had a bit of a baptism of fire at quite a young age. And it's actually not that hard to identify for someone who might be one of those key people that they know that the business is heavily reliant on them. And that gives them a bit of a badge of honor. But also, it makes them maybe feel that they've got quite a lot of job
Yeah.
security because the business is very centric around them. Helping them understanding why they might want to follow processes as a core of what the business or the business leadership needs to be thinking about. I talk about with them, what's in it for me. The business needs to identify for each team member what's in it for them. So put themselves in the shoes of that team member who might be really important and have a lot of knowledge, and understand what is the driving force for that person at that point in their life, at that point in their career, about why might they want to follow systems and processes. So let's say it was for someone who's super experienced and has been around for 20 years in the business and might be a bit of a old
Mhm.
stick in the mud. Job security might be really
Yeah.
important for them. So helping them understand that when we start to identify what our best practices in the business, it allows our business to perform in a much more consistent manner, which means our business is much more stable in the market, which means that we can have a lot more certainty about how we're performing and how we're looking after our team. So identifying what's in it for me about that particular team member, for where they're at in their business and their life, and then helping to address some of their concerns through that lens is the absolute best way of helping people start to feel more content and comfortable about being a part of a system.
That's some advice there. We talked earlier about critical client flow as the money making engine, so to speak, of a business. So I'm curious, in that early conversation you're having with perhaps the founder or the CEO, where you're mapping out the essentials of a business onto one page, is that part of the one page or is it a separate conversation or a system altogether?
No, that critical client flow
Okay,
is
it is
that
that.
one page where we look at who their favorite type of customer is. The one that if they could fire every other type of customer they have and all the difficult ones that ask too much or don't like paying so much or get ratty and just challenging to deal with, push all those people aside and think about what's the easiest customer to work with, the ones that are happy to pay and happy to use their services and refer other people, and then go, what's the service that we can do easily, that not just easily, but that the team love doing over and over again, that we know that we're really good at. And then you start to peel apart the layers of the onion about going, what actually is that? What's the way that we bring outside people into our world? And how do we start to handle those inquiries and go through our sales process? And how do we sell to them and onboard them and then give them a great result? And is there anything that happens after? That is, in a nutshell, what a critical client flow is. And again, getting that down onto just one sheet of paper makes people realize how much we overcomplicate business, because as business owners, we're excellent at overcomplicating
Yep.
how we do business, and getting it back to one sheet of paper can help people start to see the forest from the trees.
I'd love for you to unpack Systemology and all that it entails with perhaps an example of a company you worked with, perhaps in the B2B tech space, if possible.
Mhm. If I was to think about the way that Systemology works best, and as I said, it is very simple at its core, and that is the beauty of it. It is about defining what we really need to systemize rather than just randomly systemizing around the business. So we talk about define, assign, and extract. So define is all about working out, well, what do we need to actually worry about systemizing? If you think about the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, it's very much applying that to how we go about systemizing. And then assign is where we go through and look at who within the business actually has the knowledge. If we had 5 people working in, let's say for software development, it might be in coding or whatever. It might be person number 3 is great at really being systematic about how they do this particular task. Let's go work with them to identify their knowledge and make that the best practice across how we do that particular element in our business. So define, assign, and then extract. So we get out of that person's head how they do whatever it is that they do so well, and to work. This is not to create training. This is to work out what our best practice is for how we work with. When we talked about the target customer and the type of service, it's for that particular vertical. It's not thinking about how we do everything. It's how we do it for that particular solution that we're creating. Define, assign, extract, and then organize. It's great to get all these systems out of people's heads, but if you don't have them at people's fingertips, then it's actually creating more friction than is ideal. If a team member can't have a process that they might need at their fingertips in 10 or 20 seconds, what chance do you really feel like you actually have of getting someone to follow a process? You need to make it easy for people. And by making sure that you have this process written in really clear, simple language that's tuned to the reader. So if you're thinking about, you might have engineers working for you, or you might have 17 or 18-year-old high school kids that are having a gap year between university, whatever the type of person that process needs to speak to, it needs to be written in their language. So making sure that we create that in a way that is really ready for that reader to take on board. And the next stage is about integrate, which is if you had systems, but people didn't care that you had systems, then you can't have a systemized business. There is a big gap between having systems and having a
Yep.
systemized business. So the integrate stage, whilst it is one of the latter stages, it actually has to happen the whole way through. It's about identifying, like we talked about before, the what's in it for me for the team, and help them appreciate the value for themselves, but also the business, about why might they follow processes. such that when they do get all these processes available at their fingertips, that it's really easy for them to be able to go, yes, there's a win for me and a win for the business. So I'm actually going to follow the process here. Then we start to scale up the different processes and make sure we start to go across the breadth of the business. And only once we have version 1 for, let's say, the 80/20 of how the business operates, only then do we start to focus on the last stage of Systemology, which is optimize, because only then is it worthwhile starting to go, what is worthwhile actually pulling apart to create an improvement here. So we like to focus on getting all the processes out of people's heads as the thing that makes the difference, whereas optimization just makes a difference.
Interesting approach there. I'm curious if you incorporate customer viewpoints in this process of systemology.
Can you explain a bit more about that?
So, in a lot of what I was hearing, it's going within the company and trying to extract knowledge and put it down on paper, so to speak, so that we have systems to follow for best practices or good practices, however you want to define it. Oftentimes, that's great from an employee or internal IP point of view. But for a business that is, and this is true for just about any business, if the impact is really to be felt by the customer, wouldn't it make sense to capture their perspective and their outcomes or needs being met as perhaps a criteria for a particular process to have worked and worked well? And I was wondering if that is part of the overall process that you take companies through, or is that a separate sort of discussion to be had?
It's probably a separate discussion
Right.
to have, because the way that we get people to look when we're creating these systems and processes is very much from the lens of what the team is doing that creates
Right.
the result. Now, obviously, we're only going to focus on the one we know that creates a great result for the customer. And so that sort of passes the basic test of what's working for us when we go about looking who should we extract the process from. So as an example, if I was looking for to get out of someone's head how they were doing a particular task in, let's say, a retail environment, and I had two people, one that was doing sales in a context and they were amazing with the customer and had a great EQ, versus someone else who was maybe having an equally good result in terms of their sales conversions, but was more systematic. I would always focus on getting the process, the workflow out of someone who was more systematic and make sure they crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, because that will set up the person with the high EQ to get greater
Right.
success. You can't necessarily teach EQ very well, but you can teach the process workflow. So going back to about what can we look through the customer's eyes? It's quite hard to look through the customer's eyes because every customer is going to be different. However, with the critical client flow, identifying the type of customer that we really like to work with, that particular avatar, at least it means that we can actually make sure we create a really consistent result because we're targeting the same type of person, and therefore we can be really consistent with what we do.
So, assuming that we've got systems in place and the vast majority of people are able to follow it, there's obviously newfound time that we have to play with. How do we balance this idea of systemization and innovation from a revenue growth perspective?
So with the different stages of systemology that we talked through before, that we talked about, the earlier stages are really about identifying who has the knowledge and starting to go through the process of getting that out of their heads and bottling it. And only the latter stages are around optimization. As you get towards that end of those stages, we do start to focus on, depending on where you're at with how much of the business's knowledge is bottled, that's when you start to shift your time and focus towards the optimization stage. Because our mindset is the business owner's role should really be as the master systems architect. And I say that because if you think about who has the greatest perspective about how the business has run and should run, it really is the business owner because they've been there since day one. And so, if we look at the knowledge that they can bring to understanding real deep nuance about how certain elements of the business perform. Let's say it might be in how we deliver whatever it is we do for our customers. By getting them really out of the day to day, not just the day to day, but more so even the week to week or the month to month, it allows them huge amounts of time freedom to do proper deep
Mm.
work for identifying and working with the team about particular workflows, the way in which certain elements and certain structures of how we work with people are currently done, and then to go from slight iteration, which is what you might do early on in the optimization process, through to the actual reinventing of the wheel about certain ways that the business performs its functions. So early on, you'll be just doing little iterative changes about, hey, we'll tweak this thing over here, we'll insert AI over here, whatever it
Mhm.
might be. And only once the business owner's free time really starts to ratchet up to a higher level, such that they can really have true time freedom, that's when they can step into those shoes of being that master systems architect and really focus on how is our business performing for this function. If we were to pull this apart and reinvent it from scratch, what would that
Mm.
look like?
Assuming that businesses are growing and approaching, say, they're at the six-figure mark in terms of revenue, going into the seven or eight figures. Obviously, there are significant changes that need to occur within the business. Is that part of the optimization phase that you're talking about, or is there perhaps almost a rejig of the entire system that needs to occur in order to be able to get up to those seven, eight-figure revenue growth figures?
I don't necessarily focus so much on what this, let's say, the revenue
Mhm.
might be. I'm more looking through the lens of what the level of systems culture is within the business.
Ah,
And in terms of understanding where might we start to go through and optimize processes, most people might look from the lens of it being led from the
mhm,
top down. However, when you build a business that is truly system centric and that the business is about systems rather than about people, and processes become by the team
mhm.
for the team, you start to have the team identify the gaps themselves. You start to have the team identify the opportunities themselves. And so, while before I mentioned about the business owner being that master systems architect, that's when you have this harmony between everyone being on board about this is how we do things here in terms of systems are the way that we run our business. That's when the leadership within the business can interact with the team and ask them and engage them, what do we think we need with where we're at right now? So, as opposed to putting, let's say, dollars and cents in terms of revenue targets about where the business might need to be, it's much more, I guess, organic and I guess Kaizen in terms of the approach for how the business evolves. It's less, let's say, structured in terms of how that should be, because it just happens organically because the culture of the business dictates how the business should evolve for that particular, say, department, for that stage that it's at in terms of, does it need more people? Does it need to have some a new CRM come in and be implemented within the business because we've outgrown the existing one? It's not that at certain revenue levels, perhaps, or a certain team size that happens. It's as the business dictates it because of the culture of the
That's
business.
an interesting concept. I'm trying to wrap my head around this, and the idea of culture is a little bit intangible. Do you have metrics or some way of measuring how well entrenched a culture is, a system's culture is, as opposed to others?
It is inherently very hard to measure how people might
Mhm,
feel on a certain day. And if you were to do things like psychometric tests before people maybe join your business, or to do different appraisals and things like disc profiles and things like that, anyone who's looked into them at any level knows that they can be skewed
mhm,
very easily by even simply a positive or a negative conversation before someone goes and processes a test. However, going through and looking at, I like to think of Jim Collins as good to great, thinking about every business is like a bus, and you have a certain number of seats in the bus, and having the right people in the right seats is really core to that. And so when I go through and conduct performance appraisals with my team, we do go through and look at work ethic and effort levels and things like that. And I get my team members to self assess. And then we get into the appraisal, and then we see how tightly correlated what my impression is versus what their experience of their
mhm.
work is. And If the scores are actually accurate, it means you can have a really robust conversation about where they should go to. And that really starts to identify where opportunities might be in terms of things like culture and what the team are performing like. When there's a really big disconnect, however, between what they score versus what we score, that tells me that there's a really big disconnect, which probably leads back to the culture, that what the leadership is thinking versus what the
Mhm.
team might be thinking are quite disconnected. And that will probably speak to a lack of culture. So whilst it's not necessarily a metric I record across the breadth of the business, that correlation to what the team feel and to what the leadership sees, seeing those metrics actually really tightly line up during the appraisal
Mm.
process really speaks to it a lot. But we talk about that every problem in business can be solved by systems, right? And that it's more so that if something's not working within your business, that it's either because you don't have a system to solve that problem, or the system that you're using isn't working. And it's going to be one or the
Mm.
other. And when we think about, let's say, people problems in business, we often put it in a bit of a different category because, hey, but it's people. It's hard to work out what we should do here. But I'd argue that if you have great HR processes and you're looking after people and you're checking with your team and you're having appraisals and you're having off the cuff conversations and just sit down coffees and things like that, then that is a system in itself. And so, in terms of making sure you can build up the right culture, it doesn't. It's not a long bow to draw to see how, if you have the right supporting structures in place, then you can have the right qualitative
Mm.
conversations. And getting a metric to solve the problem can be a little bit more challenging. But if you put the right inputs in, it's not that hard to get the right
Mm.
outputs.
Certainly. From a revenue growth perspective, all of what you're saying certainly makes sense. I can see how it can be applied to sales. Marketing, however, can be a little bit of a different kettle of fish, so to speak, given that there's a lot of experimentation, there's technology evolving at a rapid pace, etc. How would you recommend we wrap our heads around creating systems for marketing, given the constant evolution and flux of things around them?
Mhm. There's a guy based out of Victoria called Alan Dibb. He wrote the book called
Mhm.
The One Page Marketing Plan, and he's very much a friend of Systemology and knows David Jennings very well. And he talks about random acts of marketing. And if we think about what that looks like in business, most businesses probably do random acts of marketing. They'll do a sporadic campaign, they'll put sporadic effort into certain things. Maybe it's into Google Ads, they'll put a big chunk of effort in and then it will wane over time. Or the same thing might happen with an email marketing campaign that they'll do one time, but they won't necessarily revisit and assess what worked about that, what didn't work about that, what are we going to do in terms of making sure that we do the parts that worked about that at a regular
Mm.
cadence. So if I think about marketing, a lot of people think that marketing is very, let's say, creative centric. I disagree. I happened to study marketing once upon a time, and a lot of it was about the marketing
Mhm.
analytics, about how certain things are performing. And yes, marketing can be really hard to track metrics, not dissimilar to HR in some ways, right? However, understanding that if we're consistently doing the right efforts and inputs, that over time we will start to see an increased consistency in the number of leads coming towards our business. So I'm a big fan about, you may have heard of Brad Sugar's
Mhm.
The Five Ways, the five different ways your business makes money. It's how many people know you exist, as in what's your marketing penetration? How many of those people buy from you? So therefore, what's your conversion? Of those people who buy from you, how much do they spend, the, let's say, average cart
Mhm.
price, or how much they might spend a year, how frequently they buy from you, and then what's your profit margins. All of those elements can get improved by implementing
Mm.
systems. Because if you think about, let's say, the latter, about your profit margin, that's typically to do with the efficiency of how you deliver your service. But if you look at the first one about marketing, if we're really consistent with our efforts for our marketing and we bottle what we know works well, regardless of whether it might iterate and evolve over time, just knowing what is working right now and being consistent in our fulfillment of doing that task, that role, will start to add 1%, 2%, 3% here, there across the whole breadth of those different
Hmm.
5 levers.
Given your experiences to date, could you help people put some numbers to all of this in sharing some of the improvements you've seen businesses make as a result of systemology, adopting systemology into their businesses?
Absolutely. The thing about me is if I had the option between putting an extra day into someone's week every week of the year versus an extra, I don't know, $100,000 after tax in their bank account a year, I'm the day off a week guy every single time. And so, in terms of monetary metrics, it's just not that important to me because that will flow when the free time occurs. And so, most of the people that I work with have usually already received or achieved a degree of success with their business. And having money sitting there in their bank account is all lovely. But if they don't have the free time to use it, then what's the point? And so while I know that there has been performance increase in terms of financial increases within the clients that I work with, I honestly
Mhm.
ignore it because that's not where the conversation is typically centric. When I first meet with people, it's not necessarily about how can they make more money. It's typically around how can I get the business working better without me needing to be at the helm the whole time. And so if I think about that, one of my clients was actually the first client that I worked with because I typically work with a lot of builders. He happened to have a building company and an architectural firm off the side. I think he's now got 6 businesses. And I listened to an interview of him the other day, actually, and it talked about that how with his business, his building company, he signed $1 million contract whilst away on holidays and had no involvement in the entire process except for him doing the legal signature on the
Nice.
contract. Now, for me, from where he was at the beginning to where he is now, where he's got the freedom to be able to create an impact on the building community and help educate other builders, that for me is a real success story as opposed to the sort of the dollars and cents that might be in.
And given your experience with building systems, I'm curious, as you have really invested into this, what's been the biggest challenge for you with systems at some point in your journey?
I think the biggest challenge for me early on, if I think about where I used to be, was that I knew that I needed to do them. I had no idea how to go about doing it or where to start. Then, with what I now know from what I've learnt with working with David Jennings and Systemology, it's really dramatically changed my perspective about how simple and easily it actually can be done. And when I think about how things are going into the future with creating systems and process with the rise and rise of AI, it really does make me see the opportunities about how
Mm.
quickly you can accelerate the process of the process of creating processes, but more importantly, with where things are going in the future, processes are the programming for
Mm.
AI. And as people start to go, I really want to look for the opportunities about creating efficiencies through leveraging AI in my business, understanding that bottling how your business actually functions such that you can put that information into some AI to get it to help to create results for you. That's where the real leverage is in creating processes. For the journey of it being really hard at the beginning, it's okay and manageable and really a lot easier now through to how easy it is into the future. I think it's got a really bright
Right.
future.
And a great point you make there. A fair bit of ground. But I'm curious, given the many conversations you have around implementing systems into businesses, do you find there's often perhaps a couple of areas that tend to get overlooked or glossed over? If so, what would they be?
Yes, I'd actually probably just focus on one. And it's that the business owner thinks that it needs to be them that
Hmm.
doesn't. The business owner, and historically it
Mhm.
probably was true, but the business owner typically thinks that they need to be this person that does all the grunt work. And we talk with Systemology about having a systems champion, which is that delegated person within the business, whether it's an internal role or an external hire, whatever it might be, that having a person like that in the business, that is key because it means that the business owner can really hand off the responsibility of systemizing the business. Yes, the leadership needs to drive the importance of it to make sure the business
Mhm.
understands that which way we're going, and the systems champion is empowered to be able to do their best work to create those results. But for me, that's the biggest mistake that people often make, is thinking that they have to do it. It's all on their shoulders and they have to do it.
Interesting concept there. Is this someone that you would recommend has a seat on the executive table?
Not necessarily, but it may evolve over time.
Okay.
What I see that's really surprising, it's probably not surprising the more I see it, but what happens with systems champions, they might even be brand new to the business when they start
Mhm.
that role of putting on their system champion cap. But as they start to go through and work with the team to extract the knowledge and bottle it and distribute it back to them and make sure it fits well, they start to get this real deep understanding about how the business fits together and how it works. And they become really skilled in understanding the operational workflow of the business. And I often see them stepping up into leadership roles within a year or two of being in that systems champion role. So the interesting thing with systems champions is that they are not necessarily one time. Once you pick them, they stay that role forever, but they do evolve and change over time, because people who are systems champions often end up being so valuable that they need to get put into roles of greater significance business.
So it's not necessarily your COO or chief operating officer. It could be someone else. Do they need to be within operations, or could they be outside of it?
Completely
Okay.
outside of it. And in fact, one of the roles that I perform as a systemologist is I go virtually into
Mhm.
people's businesses and perform that role for them to help speed them up and give them clarity and give them that strategic approach to how to do it the best way. But you can have someone that is complete junior, brand new, go through and do that within the business. Or you can have someone who is existing, has a lot of knowledge about the business already, and to don that cap and start to fulfill that role within the business. As long as the leadership team are recognizing that it needs to be a role, and whether they're carving out 2 hours a week or half a day a week or even a day a week to start to chip away at building those processes within the business, as long as leadership understands that importance and they start to apportion that time to a team member, that's the important part of them.
And in identifying this potential systems champion, I would be thinking first off the bat, it needs to be someone who's fairly detailed oriented. Would that be correct? And what other qualities would you look for in such a person?
So, in terms of what's the best attributes of a systems champion or the typical attributes of a systems champion, yes, being detail orientated is very much one of those. Attention to detail would probably be the highest on the list, and very high degrees of organization would be next up. But when I'm thinking about how people might identify that person, let's say within an existing team, who has the tidiest desk? Whose even desktop on their computer is the tidiest? Who already creates their own checklists and their own processes, even for their own internal reference? Look for those type of people. And what I often see is that people's minds immediately go to their right hand person, to their 2IC, thinking that type of person is already that way inclined. However, it's an important element that a systems champion should not be in leadership or have those type of leadership responsibilities, because leadership is often pushed and pulled around by emerging priorities in the business. And so you want this priority, this important element of systemizing, to be carved out, and then scheduled to the side such that nothing can impact the time that gets spent within the weeks and the months and the years of getting
Hmm.
systemized. Because systemizing is never going to be urgent
Yeah.
in a business. It'll always be important, but it's not going to be urgent. And therefore, if we give it to someone who's at the peril of other priorities that crop up in business, then it'll always get pushed down because it's never that urgent.
Thank you for that. James, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
I feel the element that it doesn't need to all be done by the business owner is absolutely the core of it, because that's often the biggest mistake that we see is the business owner thinks they need to be really hands-on and they need to know how to do the whole process. You don't. You can delegate.
And if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
It's probably best to just head to my website, biztechguru.com.au, and you can find out a lot of information about me and
Okay.
Systemology
And
there.
is there a social media handle you tend to prefer? Is it LinkedIn?
LinkedIn is where you probably see me
Okay.
most active.
James, thank you for this. It's been brilliant. We'll include links to that in the show, to those social media profiles and the website in the show notes as well.
Excellent.
Now,
Thanks.